10 days after buying my dream car, I sold it. A silver Nissan Silvia S15. Stock body, original interior. The exact car I had spent almost 5 years dreaming about. When the new owner drove away, my friends looked at me like I had lost my mind. Some thought I had run out of money. Others assumed the car had a hidden problem. One person laughed and said I simply couldn't handle owning it. They were all wrong. I didn't sell the Silvia because I was disappointed in it. I sold it because, during those 10 days, I discovered something I hadn't understood in years. The car was never the final destination. It had only led me there. After it disappeared down the road, the garage became strangely quiet. 4 clean patches remained on the dusty floor where the tires had stood. A cloth still hung beside the workbench. A cold cup of coffee sat exactly where I had left it. And in my hand was the small keychain I had removed before giving the buyer the keys. I stood in the doorway until I could no longer hear the engine. Then I picked up a broom. I swept the same section of floor again and again, mostly so my hands had something to do. Eventually, I stopped. For years, I had imagined that exact space with a Silvia parked inside it. Now it was empty again. I reached for a tape measure, stretched it across the concrete, then drew the first straight line in chalk. At the time, I still didn't know what I was building. But for the first time, the empty space didn't feel like something I had lost. It felt unfinished. To understand why, you need to know what that car had meant to me. I first saw a Nissan Silvia S15 when I was 16. Not in person. On an old computer with a slow internet connection. I had no driver's license, almost no money, and a cheap set of tools that barely deserved to be called a toolkit. But I had a folder filled with photographs of Japanese cars. One model kept appearing more than any other. The S15. The low hood, the narrow headlights, the simple shape that somehow looked calm and aggressive at the same time. At first, I only cared about the way it looked. Then I started opening photographs of the interior, the suspension, the engine bay. I understood almost none of it, but I wanted to. I printed one photograph of a completely stock silver Silvia and attached it to the wall above my toolbox. Below it, I placed a small metal box. That photograph was the goal. The cheap tools were my starting point, and the empty box was the distance between them. I promised myself that one day I would own that car. I started working anywhere someone was willing to pay me. My first proper job was unloading boxes from an old delivery truck. The work was repetitive. The boxes were heavier than they looked. At the end of the shift, the supervisor placed a few folded bills into my hand. It wasn't much. But that night I put every bill into the metal box beneath the Silvia photograph. For the first time, the dream felt measurable. My friends still went out. They bought food, clothes, and new phones. Sometimes they invited me. Most evenings I said no. Not because I didn't want to be with them, because every small amount I didn't spend moved me slightly closer to the car on my wall. It sounds disciplined when I say it now. It wasn't always. Some months I spent money I had promised myself I would save. Other months the box barely changed. And every time I began feeling close, Silvia prices climbed again. The dream kept moving away at almost the same speed I was chasing it. So I started looking for work around cars. At a small tire shop, I learned how exhausting even simple jobs could be. Rolling dirty wheels, lifting them onto machines, loosening bolts that felt welded in place. At first, it was just another way to earn money. Then one day, after removing a wheel, I stopped. Behind it were the brake caliper, the rotor, the suspension arms, and all the parts I had only seen in photographs. For the first time, the diagrams on my computer became real objects I could touch. I started asking questions. Most people ignored them. One older mechanic didn't. He worked from a small garage that always smelled like oil, metal, and old coffee. I helped him clean after closing. Sometimes he paid me. Sometimes he gave me dinner and let me use his tools. Either way, I kept returning. One evening, he noticed me watching him diagnose an engine that was running badly. He didn't give me a lecture, he simply held out a flashlight. I took it. That was the first real lesson. He taught me that replacing parts and understanding a problem were not the same thing. He showed me how to test a wire instead of guessing, how to listen before touching anything.
How one loose connection could make an entire engine seem broken. At first, I made mistakes constantly, but slowly the machines became less mysterious. Friends began asking me to look at their cars. Oil changes, brake pads, worn hoses, electrical problems. One afternoon, I repaired a small leak and thought the job was finished. The engine started. Fluid immediately appeared beneath the part I had installed. My friend looked at me. I looked at the leak. I could have made an excuse. Instead, I waited until he went inside, removed everything, and started again. By the time I finished, it was dark. That mistake stayed with me longer than the successful repair. It taught me something the older mechanic had never needed to say. Being trusted didn't mean never getting things wrong. It meant staying until you made them right. The money box slowly became heavier, but never quickly enough. Rainy month after rainy month, I added small amounts. Then opened Silvia listings and discovered that I was still behind. I began repairing more cars. A friend told his brother. His brother told someone at work. The jobs were still small, but they became regular. At the end of each day, I counted the money at the same workbench. Then I returned home, opened the same listings, and continued searching. Most S15s were modified beyond recognition. Some had rust, some had crash damage, some were missing half their engines. I traveled to look at several cars. One had serious corrosion hidden beneath fresh paint. Another had an engine bay covered in oil. A third looked complete in photographs, but had been stripped for parts. Each time, I thanked the seller and walked away. After a while, even opening the listings became exhausting. Then, one rainy night, a new advertisement appeared. Silver, mostly stock, original interior, factory body, no oversized wheels, no giant wing. The photographs were dark and badly framed, but I stared at them for almost an hour. Then I made the call. The next morning I traveled with a friend to a small property outside town. The garage door was closed when we arrived. The owner unlocked it and slowly raised it. First, I saw the lower bumper, then the factory wheels, then the front half of the car. Finally, the entire Silvia appeared in the morning light. It was exactly the kind of car I had been looking for. Not perfect, not restored, just honest. I walked around it slowly, checked the paint, looked underneath, opened the hood. The engine bay was clean and mostly original. I checked the oil, listened when the owner started it. No smoke, no obvious leaks, no strange noises. Then he handed me the keys. The test drive was quiet. No racing, no dramatic music, no sudden realization that my entire life had changed. Just an old Japanese car moving along a country road. I held the factory steering wheel, shifted into the next gear, listened to the engine. Everything felt exactly as I had imagined for years, but reality was quieter than the dream. When we returned, I looked through the side window at the interior one last time. Then I reached into my pocket and held the old keychain I had carried since I was 16. I looked at the owner and nodded. We agreed on a price, signed the paperwork. Then he placed the Silvia key into my hand. That afternoon, I drove home in the car from the photograph on my wall. I thought I had finally reached the end of the journey. I had no idea it had only just begun. For the first 2 days, I drove the Silvia everywhere. Not because I had somewhere to go, because I finally could. Every shop window became a mirror. Every empty parking lot became a reason to stop and look back. I parked it inside my garage and spent the first evening simply walking around it. I touched the front fender, studied the wheels,
sat on the concrete floor facing the car until the sunset disappeared. The dream was real, and for a little while, that was enough. On the third day, a friend called. His old Civic wouldn't start. I was standing beside the open driver's door, ready to take the Silvia out again. The phone vibrated on the workbench. I looked at the car, then at my small toolbox. A few minutes later, the Silvia was still parked inside, and I was on my way to help him. The Civic cranked but refused to start. We checked the obvious things first: battery, connections, wiring. Nothing. Then I followed one ground cable into a dark corner of the engine bay. The terminal was loose and covered in corrosion. I cleaned it, tightened it. My friend turned the key again. The engine came to life. He smiled as though I had performed magic. But the strange part wasn't fixing the car. It was how quickly I had forgotten about my own. That night I returned to the garage. The Silvia sat under the warm overhead light. I placed the toolbox on the workbench. But instead of opening the driver's door, I stopped in front of the hood. There was nothing wrong with the car. Nothing needed repairing. I opened it anyway. For hours, I traced hoses, wires, brackets, and connectors with my eyes. I wasn't trying to change anything. I simply wanted to understand it. The next morning, I sat at my old computer. At some point, driving videos became repair videos. Compression testing, engine rebuilds, electrical diagnosis. I paused the screen and drew rough diagrams in my notebook. The daylight outside grew brighter. The Silvia remained parked. I barely noticed. On the fifth day, another friend asked for help replacing a clutch. We raised his car carefully on jack stands, removed the transmission, installed the new clutch. Then, after hours of work, we guided the transmission back into place. We tightened the first bolt. Then I noticed a small metal spacer lying alone on the workbench. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Everything had to come apart again. We sat on the floor beside the jack, exhausted. Then I stood up. He stood too. We started over. Just before midnight, the engine ran normally. My friend smiled with relief. I leaned against the workbench, completely exhausted. Outside, the Silvia had been parked the entire evening, and somehow, the best part of my day had happened while I wasn't driving it. By the seventh morning, something had changed. I entered the garage holding the Silvia key, walked toward the driver's door, then slowed down. My eyes moved toward the workbench, the greasy gloves, the tools, the tiny spacer from the clutch job. I stood between the car and the bench for a long time. I still loved the Silvia. That wasn't the problem. The question was why the moments I kept replaying in my head had nothing to do with driving it. That evening, I took the Silvia out again. Same roads, same streetlights, same reflections in dark windows. The car felt perfect. The steering, the gearbox, the sound, nothing was wrong. But something no longer felt right. At a quiet intersection, I turned back early. No emergency, no mechanical problem. I simply wanted to return to the garage. When I parked, I stepped out and looked toward the workbench before I looked back at the car. That scared me. The next afternoon, while I was cleaning the Silvia, an older neighbor arrived in a tired sedan. He asked if I could take a quick look. I hesitated, then opened his hood. The quick look became several hours. We tested one possibility, then another. The sun disappeared, the work lights came on. Eventually, the engine started and settled into a smooth idle. The neighbor thanked me and drove away. I remained inside the garage, smiling slightly at the sound of the repaired engine fading into the distance. Then I turned around. The Silvia sat untouched in the darkness. I had forgotten about it again. And I hadn't missed it. That night I couldn't sleep. I returned to the garage, sat inside the Silvia. Didn't start the engine. Didn't touch the steering wheel. I simply listened to the silence. After a while I stepped out, closed the door gently, then walked toward the workbench. That was the moment I stopped asking whether I still loved the car. I did. The real question was different. Why did the garage feel more like home than the driver's seat? The next morning I opened the classifieds, not to search for another Silvia, to see what mine was worth. I closed the page, opened it again, started creating an advertisement, deleted it, walked away, returned an hour later. By late afternoon, the listing was complete. Photographs, condition, mileage, everything. Only one action remained. Publish. My hand rested on the mouse for almost 20 minutes.
The coffee beside me went cold. I looked at the old printed photograph on the wall, the one I had stared at since I was 16. Then I clicked. Nothing happened. The room looked exactly the same. The Silvia was still outside. For a moment, I wondered whether I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Then my phone vibrated. One message, then another. I turned it face down. I wasn't ready. Late that afternoon, I answered the first serious call. The buyer arrived before sunset. He wasn't a dealer. He wasn't looking for a quick profit. He walked around the car slowly, checked the panels, looked underneath, started the engine, took it for a short drive. When he returned, he stepped out with a small smile. He wanted it. Then he looked at me and made a small gesture toward the car. He wanted to know why I was selling. I looked at the Silvia, held the old keychain inside my pocket, then gave him the only answer I had. It's time. We signed the paperwork. He placed the money on the workbench. I held the Silvia key one final time, then removed the small keychain I had carried long before the car was mine. I placed the bare key into his hand. He got inside, started the engine, and drove away. I watched until the taillights disappeared, until I could no longer hear the engine. Then the garage became silent. I picked up the broom, swept the floor, stopped beside the clean patches where the tires had stood. For years, I had believed that empty space represented failure. Now I saw something else. I took a tape measure, stretched it across the concrete, and drew the first line in chalk. I still had no idea whether the decision would work, but for the first time, not knowing didn't frighten me. The first customer arrived several days later. An old sedan, a leaking valve cover gasket. Nothing impressive. I fixed it. He paid me, said thank you. Then the garage was empty again. A week passed with almost nothing. Then another customer arrived because the first one had recommended me. Some weeks were busy. Others, I swept the same floor repeatedly and wondered whether everyone had been right. Maybe I had sold my dream for an empty garage. Still, every morning I opened the door. The work grew slowly, one repair at a time, one recommendation at a time, and one mistake at a time. During one engine job, I finished the assembly and started the car. It knocked immediately. My mistake. I shut it off, called the customer, told him honestly that the car wouldn't be ready. After he left, I took the engine apart again. I worked through the night. By sunrise, it ran smoothly. I didn't charge him for the extra time. He never shouted, never demanded an explanation. He simply shook my hand. That customer returned later, then sent someone else. Trust didn't arrive because I was perfect. It arrived because I stayed when things went wrong. Years passed. The garage changed slowly. One cabinet became two. A used lift appeared, shelves filled with parts. The workbench gathered scratches that could never be removed. The floor carried oil stains that no cleaner could erase. The old wooden chair stayed exactly where it had always been. Photographs began covering the walls. Not photographs of expensive cars. Photographs of people standing beside cars they had finally gotten back. The garage never became luxurious. It became trusted. That mattered more. One rainy afternoon, I heard a familiar engine outside. I looked up. A silver Silvia stopped in the driveway. The same car, the same buyer.
both of them older now. The paint had faded slightly, the suspension was worn. A small oil leak had appeared. Nothing dramatic, just the marks of a life being lived. He handed me the keys and asked me to look after it. For the next few days, the Silvia stayed inside my garage again. But this time, it wasn't my dream car. It was a customer's car. I replaced the worn parts, fixed the leak, checked everything carefully, then placed the key on the workbench. I told him it was ready. He reached for the key, then stopped. Above the bench, on a small nail, hung the old keychain I had removed years earlier. He looked at it, then at the garage, the tools, the customer cars, the photographs, the scratched workbench. Finally, he placed the Silvia key back beside the old keychain. He had been thinking about selling it. Before offering it to anyone else, he had come to me. Not to give me the car, to give me the first chance. We agreed on a fair price. For the first time in my life, buying the Silvia didn't require giving up everything else. A week later, I drove it back into the same garage. Not into the center, not beneath a spotlight. Into the same corner where it had stood years before. The wheels stopped where the old tire marks had once been. Outside, several customer cars waited for the next morning.
Inside, tools covered the workbench. Cold coffee sat beside unfinished jobs. The floor was dirty. The shelves were full. Nothing looked perfect. Everything looked alive. I stepped out of the Silvia, then looked around the garage. Not at the car. At everything that had grown around the space it once occupied. I reached for the light switch. The room fell into darkness. For a moment, the outline of the Silvia, the workbench, and the old chair remained visible together. Then I pulled the garage door closed. The last line of warm light disappeared beneath it, and the garage became quiet again. This time, it wasn't empty.